A behind-the-scenes look at how games are made and the people who make them. This is GameDev Deconstructed. Hey everybody, I just got done recording this conversation with Chris DeLeon. Some of the things that I highlighted from our conversation were his thoughts on academia and formal education for developers in general, and also he has a whole lot of experience in making games and teaching game development, as well as talking about the game development process. So I kind of wanted to explore that with him, and the conversation covers a lot of ground. He's definitely a fast thinker, so if you miss anything, just rewind a few seconds and you'll catch it that time around. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Chris DeLeon. Hello and welcome to another episode of GameDev Deconstructed. I'm your host, Nick Culbertson, and I'm here today with Chris DeLeon. That is at Chris DeLeon on Twitter. Chris is the founder of Gamkedo, which is helping people to learn to make games. He's been making games for 20 years. This is from your bio. He's worked with startups, AAAs, and spoke at probably more conferences than you can remember, but some of the big ones being GDC and Indiecade, and has taught his course to over 100,000 people. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And also, you put on a game dev podcast where you've interviewed over 90 people. So I'm really...
There's over 90 episodes. Some of those are like recordings of when I've given talks at schools, at local IGDA chapters, at other stuff. But 90 episodes, maybe 80, 85 of those are interviews or something.
Okay, and I've also noticed there have been some heavy hitters you've been interviewing, so I definitely want to get into some of the tactics of how you've refined your pitch for getting those people.
I actually like to clarify, I always also put a big asterisk by this to not disrespect people who've been on my podcast. I actually got a way to not have the heavy hitters in my network on my show. I know lots of people who are usually interviewed, who are in magazines and whatever, and I feel like they get plenty of coverage. I think plenty of people hear their perspectives, plenty of people hear their stories, and I think it actually does some damage that so often the only views people hear from are the very studio top people, the very famous people, the sort of ones who appear like they're overnight successes. Obviously, they put in the work behind that. But a lot of what my podcast is about, this Gamkedo community, is trying to help give a kind of a bigger cross-section of view of what game development looks like for so many other people in the world doing it, kind of the majority of it. Like, the expected value of if I get into making games, what might it look like if I'm working on back end, if I'm working on a role in a big company where no one maybe has heard my name. They might have heard the game, but they haven't heard my name. In those kind of things, or people who are at the hobbyist level, indies at various level, they're kind of working their way up the ladder. But so for what it's worth, that's been actually strategic intention on my part.
Yeah, so I think I've seen two angles with that. One being I like seeing how the other folks live because I am an indie, so I like seeing how big companies operate.
Right on.
And also in trying to find the way to transition from being the one-man shop to becoming one of these small studios or eventually larger studios. There's sort of a chasm between becoming just your one-person team and then building into something much larger.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that chasm's actually got, in many ways, has less to do with games and more to just do with business in terms of anybody trying to earn income, just kind of, doing the kind of the indie hustle, the gig economy, whatever. It's a lot of work and hustle to even earn back enough value from customers directly to be paying one person's livable wage, let alone a studio of them. And so usually what obviously is happening at that point of bridging some sort of gap is really they're finding outside funding of some kind. Whether they're trying to leverage previous traffic numbers, previous awards, previous successes that they can kind of wave a ticket from to try to get someone else to invest in their company because they make a business case on here's going to be a return on your investment, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, that golf has to do with this difference between trying to kind of fuel their own fire versus finding someone else who like owns essentially a coal factory and is like, hey, I can turn your money into more money, and here's the case I can present for that, which is a big part of that gulf. I think sometimes people are missing out on.
Right. It's also difficult once you get to a point where you actually need to invest your own funds into the thing you've created because that's sort of taking some of what you feel like the worth of your entire studio, in quotation marks, is, and then putting it back into creating new product, which is a gamble.
Right. No, absolutely. And it's something where it's part of why I encourage whenever anybody's trying to build that bridge for themselves, that they're finding some other stable source of income, whether it's, and I say stable with big hand waves, because it includes in many cases the contract work where they are doing work for hire externally. Someone else needs some sort of even if it's like not games or not awesome or not as exciting. But, you know, I've known lots of indies who for many years before they were talking on stage about their award-winning game, they were making like training flashcard applications for the military contractors. They were doing like educational software development stuff for business firms who need to train their sales force or whatever. Things that like there's core skill sets can do. There's market value there's money on the table for like, hey, if you can deliver this product by this date, we'll pay you. And that allowed them to like be able to invest their energy into trying their thing without having to feel that same sort of desperate pinch of I have to do right now what the market's going to pay me for. And that may not be the creative idea they have in mind. That may not be the thing that they want to bank on, that they feel like is their voice, as opposed to the echo chamber of here's what right now, today, the trend is popularly published, proven, which is also, of course, like kind of a bloody water of everyone else is also aiming their lasers on that same kind of target. However easy or obvious it seems, it's a high competition sphere.
Right, and I feel like your YouTube channel goes into a lot of these points and really explores it nicely. If no one has, I think a lot of people are watching this on your YouTube channel, or if you're just listening to the podcast, I'd recommend people checking it out because it does cover a lot of underexplored topics within the world of game development. And on that note, what have you sort of learned around creating content about the production of games, and what has seemed to engage audiences the best?
Sure. So in terms of creating content, one thing I find important to differentiate, because often it's like, oh, maybe people watch the channels. Like I can assure you, most of them probably don't. And that's partly because I have a high number of subscribers, but my actual daily viewership is not enormous by any stretch. My numbers of daily viewership are kind of comparable to the maybe non-daily viewership of a much smaller channel per video. And it's probably because there's this big difference between what really kind of draws in the crowd as opposed to where the value is. And this partly has to do with, I like to think of the example, a lot of my business stuff is kind of modeled after martial arts dojos, partly because I'm a training kind of person, partly because I like the idea that it's a skill we develop not just to do it, but to enrich our lives, to improve our understanding of the world, to give us some self-discipline, some perspective on ourselves, that kind of thing. But because of that, there's a huge difference in a martial arts sort of business where they will bring some of their top level people out. They'll do like a demonstration in a public space. And that's like, it's spectacle. It's trying to draw attention. It's trying to get people to come check out what actually goes on in a dojo. And then when they're there, they're like, wow, this is way less flashy. This is way less exciting. There's not a lot of kicking and flipping over their head like they might do in a public demonstration. It is like drill after drill after drill. It's a lot of practice, it's a lot of running. And so that's where I differentiate between, I have viral videos where I'll do speed coding. I've been programming games for 20 years. I did nightly prototypes for over 200 nights in a row outside of a day job. And so I've done lots of very rapid prototyping stuff anymore because my work involves, I talk people through code remotely while they're kind of screen sharing. They get stuck. They're working on a game. I'm not actually familiar with the code base, but I can just talk them through it on the fly without having to use autocomplete, without having to use test, compile, whatever. My work requires me to do that. So now I can just sort of like riff, at least at a very crude level, on just like getting functionality there very efficiently without a lot of kind of fiddling around. But that's very different from how I got there, how anybody gets there. That's like not, the day two activity. That's the I've now done this sort of drill so many times in these sort of little chunks that it's a different kind of relationship to it. And so that's why, at the end of the day, when I do these viral videos, et cetera, really, it doesn't even steer them back to my channel. It steers them mainly towards take my free video course, codeyourfirstgame.com, where instead of doing it in 5 minutes, we spend 3 hours talking through how to type up like the simplest, most like crude, old, classic 1970s style game. And that's where a lot of them kind of hit a wall. Some people go through it, some people don't, but they're like, okay, I see that this is not quite as flashy as the demonstration was. And then the YouTube videos have more to do with actually those people who are kind of past that hurdle and are then just kind of following along, listening to, okay, like kind of day-to-day issues and struggles, which often aren't even technical. They're not even creative. They are, in terms of the issues, not the people. A lot of the issues have to do with motivation, have to do with productivity, have to do with perspective, have to do with patience, have to do with all these other kind of sides to the coin that we can get kind of lost in the fury of thinking about the skills where, like, if you can't keep yourself doing it, then the skills don't matter, or the skills will never get to a point where they matter.
Right, and some of the videos that you've made, in particular, there is one on rituals that just came out. You're talking about things that I think don't only apply to game developers, but apply to sort of life and work in general. So do you feel like the idea of creating content for game developers, do you feel like that is too large of a niche or is too small of a niche, or where do you see that?
It's tough. I mean, it's a niche. And for many years, I made things very game developer specific. I wrote the hobby game dev blog essentially weekly for 6 years. And that was kind of my focus of an audience. And part of what led me away from that was having I think I made some old articles or old videos or whatever about this idea that, okay, well, you don't just want to kind of live in one pigeonhole. Even if your company, your job, whatever might have like, okay, I'm a software engineer. I need to program. I need the best programmer we have. That's who I am here to these people. That for our own kind of development, our own enrichment, our own ability to prototype, it's valuable to balance that with other skill sets we at least get kind of functional fluency in. I've done some level design also. I've done some pixel art also. And if nothing else, this allows us to prototype in a way we don't have to go tug on someone else's shirt and beg them and be like, hey, I need to persuade you to work on my thing with me. Instead, we can kind of put it together on our own, show others, and make a case for, look how cool this is. It'll be even cooler with your involvement. And when I made that kind of point, I was just sort of hanging around chatting with some friends that I think I knew a lawyer in Atlanta. We were kind of hanging out, house party, housewarming, whatever. And someone else was like, well, that seems not just related to game developers, but like lots of people could benefit from that kind of advice in a way that I just been so long in this game developer bubble. I hadn't really thought about. I guess that's true. Like probably some other stuff, like, a bit of a reach for me since I hadn't had experience in these other kind of domains that someone else might have. But that's where I kind of got some encouragement to, since a lot of my aim is really to how do I help people? How do I improve people's lives? How do I help them get past their barriers, whatever? Realizing that I could potentially be having more net benefit if I can find ways to kind of recast some of my messages so they're not as specific to game developers, maybe still applicable to game developers, but not having to make it as specific to examples grounded in, okay, let's say you're programming C# and the following thing comes up, and instead being able to take just one level step back of abstraction. And more recently, this has kind of formed itself in, so with our Gamkedo club, a lot of, I kind of say partly learn from a dojo, partly learn from like a workout gym or whatever, where there's this challenge where people join because they want to get themselves to do this thing. They mean to do this thing. It's hard to get themselves to do it. It's difficult. It's uncomfortable. But they want to get better at it and they want to improve at it. And one huge difference between me and how, say, typical gyms are operated is a real gym, they want you to sign up for that year-long membership and then never go. I think I saw an article the other day that was like, a gym has maybe like 1,600 people who are technically there, but like the gym supports 40 at a time, because no one's ever actually showing up. They pay for attending. Whereas I'm on the other end of the coin of like my entire purpose is how do I help get these people to do it? So when people join, if they're not doing stuff, I'm kind of like trying to create new structures, new systems, new processes. I'm kind of tagging experienced members like, hey, can you follow up with so-and-so? It seems like they're kind of maybe like slowing down or falling off the wagon. Make sure they're okay. And like I kind of don't want to funnel a whole bunch of traffic into it until we can better solve that problem of how do we help get people who are here getting out of it what they want to get out of it. But that's something that like, again, zoomed out is something that in many people's lives are having this challenge of maybe it's songwriting. Maybe they want to start a podcast. Maybe they want to write a book. Maybe they want to do something else that's not programming games, but they're struggling to get themselves to do it. And so that's where I'm trying to look at, can I generalize some of our same sort of problem-solving techniques, some of our processes, some of our attitudes, some of our writing about how we solve those problems internal to our club in a way that can help others out there who they just want to learn guitar. They just want to build up the courage to ask for promotion or whatever. And a lot of those involve some of these same psychological challenges of I can't get myself to do this thing that I want to get myself to do. And that's where I've kind of been focused.
Yeah, and a lot of these ideas that I see you bring up seem to have a academic background to them. I know you've given a lot of talks at schools. I'm wondering, where are sort of some of these psychological inspirations that you have? Is it from listening to podcasts or reading certain authors?
It's a mix of things. Some of it is, some of it's frankly from, and I often will cite these people like the kind of the motivation self-help guru people where I mentioned on some other podcasts, I'm a huge fan of like old Tony Robbins. I mean like original Tony Robbins. I don't mean like currently old Tony Robbins. His focus has shifted now to a totally different kind of market and space. But these kind of people who, when I was in academia, there was a certain kind of approach to writing, to rigor, to research, to attitudes, to thinking that, it has its place if we're doing medical research or whatever. But they'd be very dismissive of these other people who their focus in their industry was how do we help improve people's lives? How do we get them to do things they mean to do? How do we help them reach their goals? How do we help them do these things? And when I kind of opened up to like, there's a lot of real value there, but it's cast in a way that's turning off smart people from it. That's where I realized sort of a disconnect. And so, my brother-in-law was in the house the other day. He saw we had a CD case on my counter, and he was like, "Why do you guys own this? And why is it open?" And that CD case was a Joel Osteen audiobook. And I was like, "Look, I don't believe anything the guy says. I'm an entirely secular person, but his message, notwithstanding the part where he's like, give more money to the church to get supernatural benefit from it, but the rest of his message, a lot of stuff he says and teaches has helped improve people's lives, has helped people get somewhere, has helped people get themselves past a difficult time they're going through, whatever. And so I see part of my value is trying to help translate some of these things from these kind of spaces where, whether it's from The Secret, whether it's from Tony Robbins, whether it's from Joel Osteen or whoever, into like, okay, well, what are the threads of like real utility in there, where between these things that are kind of like wishy-washy, there's quantum physics and then there's laws of attraction kind of stuff, but what in there is really working at a purely grounded, rational, secular level that I can kind of make a case for, like, here's why and how, if you picture a goal before you've done it, you can actually help get yourself to do it. And I think that in that way, I'm trying to help it reach people who otherwise are capable, are smart people, are in fact turned off by how a lot of that stuff is kind of pitched, and then to kind of hopefully derive some benefit from, oh, okay, now they're able to get themselves mobilized in a way that I think we're all kind of suffering a little bit from the amount of people who are capable of stuff and aren't really achieving what they're capable of.
Right. And I think your videos do a great job of distilling these ideas into a bite-sized chunk. People can watch a 2-minute video and sort of get the gist of some of these things. The super impressive and yet daunting task of it is that you're producing or at least putting out videos daily. So how have you sort of refined that approach to be able to put out this kind of quality of content consistently?
Sure. A lot of the to the extent there's quality in it, it's always because it's based on something I've already worked with a human being on. And so I had the same question come up in an email the other day from I've got a separate mailing list, getyourselftodothing.com or getyourselftodothings.com, which is based around this like non-game challenges people run into. And somebody emailed me back and was like, okay, well, my challenge is I'm trying to get myself to start a video course. I see you've done that. How come I can't get myself to make a video course? And I point out the reason why my video courses have done enormously well is because before they were video courses, first I did a bunch of like in-person workshops with a whole bunch of just volunteer students. Then I volunteered for 8 months on weekends, teaching it to anybody who would listen to it. Then I did private training for a couple years, walking people through the exact same material. But every time I'm accumulating questions of what people asked and when. So by the time I turn it into a video course, I'm able to lock into this approach. As soon as they have a question, I'm answering the question as if I just read their mind. And that comes from the fact that it was built on an actual conversation with actual people working through the material. So most of the stuff that's in these videos, it's not like just each day I kind of like have a brain spasm and then run with it. It's something that like the previous day or the previous week in my club office hours, in my private training with people, in my email lists or whatever, I've engaged with somebody on this topic. And by the time it's a video, it's my second, third, fourth, 10th draft talking through an idea in a way that it can just be kind of passing on, okay, well, here's a problem somebody ran into. Let's not expose their private details or circumstances, but instead let's generalize it a little bit to, in case this relates to where you're at, here's some topic that when someone heard something helped click for them. Or in some cases, too, it's just something that I heard from somebody else earlier in my career that was just sort of this happenstance thing. Maybe they didn't even think it would stick with me or resonate with me or whatever, but as I've found helpful in helping get me to do things I meant to do. A lot of my path has been kind of pushing through obstacles and then sticking with things longer than some maybe perfectly reasonable person might otherwise choose to do. And those have usually come from these things, and I want to share that kind of what helped me do that. And so it's usually a mix of those two kind of things.
And so what value has this brought to you putting out this content?
Sure. I mean, mainly I think it's just that it helps me feel like I'm doing what I'm doing with integrity. And that's something that I had someone comment the other day, which I appreciated because not everyone recognizes this. He was like, he knows I could explode much bigger on YouTube if I would just do a bunch of speed coding videos, but he appreciates that instead, like, I've helped him improve his life. And again, like, this is where I don't care if it wouldn't sell concert tickets or whatever. I would rather have a huge impact on fewer people in terms of really making a difference for them than getting a ton of people to kind of crack a smile, which there's nothing wrong with that. And that's what the kind of business certain people kind of run. But in my case, I would rather have people who are at a point where they're trying to improve themselves, do something, get something better for themselves out of their life, and that I'm able to really kind of connect with them and do something with that. And that might come from a more intimate kind of connection to the audience in the sense that, I like that some guy commented a long time ago saying I was like the game dev Mr. Rogers. And I thought that was something that was a huge compliment to me as someone who Mr. Rogers, would go up there and make a real clear case to government funding as to like, look, this is not really expensive content to produce. It's not going to reach as many people as a cartoon hammer hitting another cartoon on the head, but it's important for the following reasons. And that's kind of where I'd like to – I certainly don't see myself being yet, but it's certainly kind of the sort of thing I'm trying to build up and do and get better at continuously through practicing it. And part of what I've loved about the fact that I run my own business, I don't have any boss besides myself and I suppose distribute among my customers, is that I don't have someone else who is kind of looking at me, my experiments like this and being like, oh no, you got to stay on task. You got to do what's going to get maximum traffic. You got to go what's get maximum returns on your investment. And instead, I can be like, okay, I'm staying ahead of my costs. I'm running a successful, functioning, smooth business my way, and the way I think works with integrity. And this also helps protect that from the way that I teach things. Part of why I steered away from university was this feeling that even though they do lots of good in the world, and I never like to sound like I'm hating on them, because lots of good people work there. They help improve people's lives. It's a good solution for many people, certainly for many fields, is I do feel like as their costs have exploded, there's a lot of really systematic reasons why otherwise perfectly good, sound, reasonable, rational, sensible people have found themselves kind of essentially working for the Death Star. And I use this example because, like, there's kind of this old joke about, like, well, when they blow up the Death Star, like, all these stormtroopers died, and, like, weren't those just maybe, like, I don't know, how guilty were they? And there's this thing of, like, I don't dislike people in those institutions, but I didn't feel like I was doing the right thing when I was teaching a class of people and I knew how much money they were paying to be in that class, and I knew the odds of success they were going to get in their field from what the institution was able to deliver on. And I just didn't feel like that was the right value trade for me to be a part of. And I prefer that now I'm running a much leaner business, almost entirely digital. I can keep costs much lower for the people I'm working with. I can deliver much higher value per unit of cost. Again, not trying to, like, compete at the level of these universities or whatever in terms of what they do, but certainly far more than 1/700th of the value, which is closer to what I charge.
Right. And I think, yeah, the value, it seems like with your course, is it is personal development through making games. You're teaching these people to get over something that could be either a psychological hump or just the not having the know-how. But I am curious where you sort of see the direction of academia when it comes to game development. I mean, is it still a necessity for people trying to get jobs in the industry?
A lot of this has to do with the difference between huge companies and tiny companies. And this is something that part of one of my early shifts in thinking about the industry is, so I started in the industry of electronic arts. I'd done a couple internships. They seemed to like me. I was getting a lot of good work done there. But a friend of mine from undergrad was unable to finish his undergrad degree. And that was personal reasons. That was family reasons. That was all kinds of circumstances. It wasn't because he was dumb. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, but he couldn't finish his degree. And so, okay, but he had made done awesome work, had worked on a ton of games. And so I went to our HR at the big company, and I was like, okay, can we hire this guy because he's a genius and he does incredible work, and check out his portfolio, et cetera. And look, he didn't finish his degree. And we only hire people who have degrees from one of these 5 institutions in this particular field. And I realized I don't want to work for a place that's not smart enough to hire this guy. And so I just got the hell out of there. And instead went off to the small company, a startup. That's when I changed to the startup, because they would hire this person because they didn't care who finished school. They needed someone who could do the work. And I was like, that's who I want to be with. I want to be with someone who actually looks at the people, who considers what they can do, what value they bring. And that's just a very different kind of, granted, understandably, it's different at the scale of 4 or 5 or 6 human beings to look at that kind of stuff versus understandably at an enormous institution with thousands of people. I'm empathetic to the fact that they have this tidal wave of resumes to sort through. And so their first question they're doing is just throwing away things that don't have a right certification on the front of it, because they have enough qualified people among that stack that's left over to still fill all their roles. And so, it's not even like hating that that's an institution that operates, not hating their product, it's not hating the people involved. It's just to say that wasn't where I wanted to be or how I saw myself kind of fitting into things. And so this is where it comes back to the academic question of, if someone's looking for a giant company opportunity, they will often look at those kind of certifications. And this is the same discussion that kind of helped steer me back into graduate school after I'd spent a few years kind of doing my own indie stuff. Was I met with Warren Robnett, creator of Atari, back when I lived out near Palo Alto. And he was explaining to me that, okay, well, you got a really solid undergraduate degree, but it's still only an undergraduate degree. And 10 years from now, somebody else who has a master's might be above you in some sort of food chain, or you want some sort of opportunity, like working with some sort of government grant from a defense contractor, from who knows, from some sort of science and health institution, whatever. And they're just going to immediately look at shortcuts of what certifications does this person have. And someone who's got a master's or a PhD is going to out-level me in those opportunities in a way that, doesn't matter what I've done since, that they need those shortcuts because they don't have time to analyze every brain that gets in front of them, or they're from outside the domain. They are medical specialists. They are government politician, bureaucrat people. And they don't speak the language to understand how impressive it is or isn't that my freeware game reached X number of people or whatever else I've done outside of, again, what they recognize is this person got a following degree in the following field at a master's level from this institution I've heard of, checks boxes for them that allows them to make a case to their boss, to their peers, whatever, to make that sort of things work. This is also where, again, this kind of huge company versus small company difference, part of what put me on that path was he made a rightful case. And this is, again, maybe this was like 2009, but this was still true. He was like, there's certain professions where if you don't have the credential, they won't let you do it. You don't get to be a lawyer without a law degree. You don't get to be a doctor without a medical degree. You don't get to be a psychologist without certain certifications and, experience and whatever. And certainly to teach at a university level, you can kind of do it, but you're going to hit a heavy wall. And that was what he had. He had lived that experience for 8 years. This was a guy who created the genre that Zelda was in as making Atari Adventure in his 20s. And he still was unable to get past a certain level of promotion because these people who'd been through the 8-year PhD slog were never going to let him pass them up. And he just felt this sort of challenge and struggle for him. And that's where, started where I kind of pivoted off from university, besides feeling like this wasn't kind of the right way for me to be teaching, was I talk very fast, as people listening can tell. And so when I would teach my people, when I was teaching at Georgia Tech while I was still a grad student there, I would do my lectures in a way that part of the challenge there too was we're in a field where some people came in with computer science background. Some people came in with completely non-technical degrees in arts and English and whatever. Not there's anything wrong with those, but I was teaching a technical field and I had people in my class from both backgrounds. And so there was this constant struggle of I'd either be boring half the class or overwhelming the other half. And so what I would do is I'd kind of like do my best to kind of split the difference in how I teach it. Then I would go across the sidewalk to the library. I'd record a video version of the lecture I just gave. So now they could go back and they could review it. They could pause it. They could go to the part they had questions about if they were, coming from a non-programming background. And I put those videos online. Those videos got thousands of views. And because I was like, well, they're online, may as well share them. And that was where, in talking to some of my advisors, I realized that the way university system is structured is that the university is going to own these videos. Those are Georgia Tech's forever. It doesn't matter if I go somewhere else. Doesn't matter that I left. Doesn't matter if I was a professor there or a student there or whatever. Those are Georgia Tech's videos.
Right.
And I decided if I'm going to be teaching thousands of people online through my videos, those should be my videos. And that's not some sort of like ego thing. That's because otherwise it's up to someone else whether they take them down. It's up to somebody else whether they replace them. It's up to somebody else how they're used, etc. And that was something where like, okay, well, I should be the one making the call of, is this material at a point where it should be replaced, updated, removed, positioned somehow differently? And so that's where I was like, okay, I'm from teaching online, I'm going to do it myself. And sure enough, I'm now reaching like 6,000 new students a month through my video courses, as opposed to like the pace that I was reaching at university was much lower than that. And granted, it was a different kind of connection to the people, but that's where the difference between that is my club is more like where I have this connection to these people. And basically I've built a way that I'm still teaching in a tiny company environment, and it doesn't matter I don't have that PhD because I didn't care when I hired myself to do this. It's a small company versus giant company kind of difference.
Right. Yeah. I can see that. And I don't know if your approach would work for everyone who is out there and thinks, you know what, I'm going to make my own sort of YouTube channel where I'm going to talk about content, because the quality content is great. And I can now see it's from the background, the extensive background you've had with it. But I think a lot of it also has to do with who you are and where you get your energy. Like, I think some of the tactics that have worked for you wouldn't necessarily work for everyone else. So what do you think is that driving force for you?
I think it's a variety of so I mean, and for what I want to clarify too, like there are people who kind of like me are producing content that helps address begin game developers, et cetera, but are coming from a totally different and often less experienced background. So they haven't been making games for 20 years. They're on their first or their second or third year. And that actually reaches still reaches an audience in a pretty valuable way, where it actually can help someone feel like they're learning alongside somebody. And I've actually had the opposite problem. I gave a talk at IndieCade maybe 9 years ago, and someone's first question was like, yeah, but like you've worked for Will Wright and done this other, like you were in Forbes 30 under 30 and these other impressive things. How can you relate to our situation or us to yours? And like in my case, because I specialize in helping beginners, so like they're always in my attention. But in general, people can often connect to someone else who's like I know I was just on another podcast where some of the people are just making their first game and kind of sharing their experience going through it. And that's a way that some people are now currently building an audience that hopefully can become a lifetime audience for them. But in terms of my energy and my origin stuff, a lot of it has to do with finding ways to, like I say, some mixture of making sure I'm doing things with integrity, not liking the compromises I've seen get made when things are done at different scales or through traditional means, when there's somebody else who has to kind of like be at the mercy of what's going to maximize profit or growth or something else in exchange for doing it kind of what by my or someone else's definition might be the right or sensible or fair way, in terms of, especially what someone's going to not regret having gone through. And this is where, again, I know plenty of folks who they've made trade-offs and then they hate the debt that they're in after they've made it. And then that actually really is part of what also has been a source of inspiration for energy, is having seen people who made these massive compromises to their lives for several years. We're talking like long distance relationships, losing fiancés, decade plus of debt, et cetera, for a degree, where when they leave there, they are no better positioned for what they wanted to actually do than they were when they entered. And that sort of stirs up a certain anger is the wrong word, but a certain kind of sense of injustice in me that I want to try to do better about, in terms of A, not being a part of that, and B, trying to create a better alternative to it, rather than just complaining about it, trying to figure out, okay, well, what might it look like for something where somebody does not have to relocate, somebody does not have to quit their day job, somebody does not have to basically put all their chips on the table and bank on the entire next stage of the career, this or bust. And that's the sort of thing I've been trying to build as to something that I feel like is addressing that need in a very practical way, as opposed to, again, kind of hands up in the air. Part of what led me to do what I was doing was I would meet with professors about, this was the track I was on in life. And they just seemed so helpless about what's going on at that level of institutional cost, of rising tuition, of the debt system, of all these sort of things. And it'd be different. If these were a bunch of stupid people and they had this problem, I might have been like, you know what, I can come in here and I can fix this. But this is some of the smartest people I've met in my entire life. Like, their job is to basically be smart about their field and to have human skills. And they were just like hands up in the air, like, there's nothing we can do. Like, this problem is so much bigger, so much more systemic than any one of us, than our whole department, than our one institution. We don't know how to turn this aircraft carrier, but like, we're on for the ride at this point. And that's where, like, again, I figured, okay, well, I am not so arrogant as to think I'm going to put myself in their shoes and fix that problem from that side. I'm going to try to start over and do something different. And that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think academia really can build that muscle for people. My wife was getting a master's in anthropology, and just seeing sort of that environment where people are having to put their entire lives into this thing. And at a certain point, you do reach that point where it's like, is this really the course I should be on? But then you have student debt, and you've already invested so much time in it that you feel like you have no choice but to push forward, even if it doesn't seem like the best path.
Exactly. And again, it is tough because I every time I have these sort of things, which they're partly painful to have, because it is a good solution certainly for many people. It improves the circumstance. It might be a trade-off that reach opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Certainly it has lots of benefits from the network, and that's still true today as it ever was, as to the professors know people, the career counselors know people, the classmates know people, that's part of the value. But it just feels like it's out of all proportion and cost to, I don't know, be manicuring a 400-acre garden and having a football stadium and all this other stuff, to like, man, if it's network and hearing from experts and whatever, that's like why we have industry guest speakers join us remotely, where for an hour of their time all year long, they hop in once, they have a chat with our people, they feel this connection to, they've heard from people from industry perspectives, and then I'm able to doubly share that content as often any more of my podcast episodes are often those interviews, me just kind of rebroadcasting that to reach more folks, because we can still have the benefit of those conversations without having to be in a classroom with a closed door. I remember when I was at Carnegie, and like the amount of things that on campus felt free in terms of access to these resources, materials, our club, we didn't have dues. And then, as I was swiping my key card to enter a building, remembering just how not free any of this was, just how paywall, locked up behind padlocks, behind website logins, et cetera, all of these opportunities were. And so it didn't matter that our club didn't have dues. It was still a 4 or 5 digit per semester price tag for someone to have access to it. And that's where, with my current club, I've kind of tried to, as best I can, recreate that structure, that culture of work and so on, without having to have it be behind a university paywall.
Awesome. Yeah. So I want to shift over now and start talking about marketing. And this will be obviously a loaded topic, but I'm curious what your approach is to, one, marketing games, but also in marketing yourself, your own personal brand, and how that is positioned within Gamkedo.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So a lot of what I do is what's called content marketing. And that's just basically the business word for like writes articles, does podcasts, makes videos that are free. And the idea of content marketing is just trying to kind of establish oneself as an authority, where we basically put out their messages, where the core point of the message isn't to sell somebody something, it's to help establish this person knows what they're talking about. It's to try to create something that people share, people talk about, people discuss, people can kind of reflect on, people bring up as examples. It's a chance to kind of stay sharp and improve at how we articulate things. That occasionally there's videos where frankly, it's an echo of a video I know I made 3-4 years ago. A, most people haven't seen that video anyway. B, now that I'm reflecting on it with some more recent experiences, with some sort of more times kind of walking real people through it, etc., I can do a much sharper, clearer, to the point version of it in a way that's no longer the same message if it's delivered better. And so that's something that it's been, I think, also really helping to kind of exercise those muscles of communication, of speaking. More recently, I've been experimenting. I'm always surprised when people in comments do or don't notice something or call attention to it. But like, I gesticulate a lot with my hands when I talk. And so for review videos, I was like, I'm going to experiment with just like not letting myself move my arms and see how I feel about that. And just these little experiments that I can do because I'm just constantly producing content. And I don't feel this pressure over like when I was a research student and I would do months of research and reading and finding examples and preparing and publishing papers in journals and speaking at conferences. And then I'd make a YouTube video out of it. And it'd be like a 45-minute long video with slides and all this kind of stuff. You know, when you did like one video every 4 or 5 months, you really felt this pressure to like make that video as best as that video could possibly be made. When it's just constant content, I just feel safer kind of experimenting all over the place and like whatever, not a whole like most of my audience will never see this. Those who do will forgive it because it's going to be lost in the tidal wave of my other content, whatever. So content marketing for me has been my main mechanism, partly too because it requires next to no money, asterisks, you know, the usual thing of like it takes time.
Right.
But it's not something where I'm like feeding money into a advertising funnel or something, which is usually kind of how traditionally businesses might structure things, as to very proactive versions of running ads, running whatevers. And I also think that this has been a better fit for the kind of audience that I bring in terms of when someone joins Gamkedo Club, it's usually somebody who they have some understanding from my content of kind of like my philosophy of doing things in a way that'd be much harder for someone to like see a banner ad, click on it and be like, let's do what these people do, because our approach is so much different than the usual assumptions about what indie game development consists of, about what making games or learning programming or these things are like, or what an online community is like, that until they kind of feel like they've gotten to know me, then they kind of, if they joined, they'd be kind of surprised about what they found anyway, in terms of it's just not what most of the world kind of assumes is this sort of thing's like. And as part of that too, there's this old kind of example from the business world of, and it's also a difference between, you know, I'm not trying to sell somebody a $1 app. And that's something that I used to do. I paid my rent for a year and a half in San Francisco with an iPad app that sold for maybe $2.99 or something. But like, it's a very different way to engage an audience to try to get a $60 a month membership out of somebody in a way that I'm doing to consistently deliver on and exceed that value. It's a different kind of sales pipeline. It's a different kind of connection to somebody. And to make that sort of like non-trivial actual investment from somebody, they need to feel like they get to know you in a way that they may not have to, like, say, plunk down $3 on something. And so there's this whole thing from kind of the sales world where, like, until someone really feels like they've heard from you for maybe about 7 hours with your content, and this is part of the value of podcasts, it's part of the value of YouTube videos, et cetera, is that they can kind of get to feel like they get to know you. And it's the point that often we have people join the club where it's like they're so used to seeing my YouTube videos or whatever that by the time that they have office hours with me, it's a little surreal as to, like, the video is talking to them where it's my same background and it's like me here live as opposed to a pre-recorded message. And it kind of takes a minute to snap out of it and be like, oh yeah, like I never actually knew they were on the side of that line. But they can still feel like they got to know me. And so they know who they're talking to. And that kind of relationship building doesn't happen from banner ads, doesn't happen from paid promotion, doesn't even happen from press coverage. It comes from putting content out there and putting yourself in front of people kind of consistently.
And do you feel like by branding Gamkedo and yourself separately, do you feel like these two things are synergistic in growing an audience for both? Or do you feel like it detracts?
It's a little tricky. For many years, I didn't do any brand stuff at all. I only put Chris DeLeon on my games. I was in the credits. It was a game by Chris DeLeon, or I was the producer and main programmer or whatever. What I eventually did that helped me lead to the value of the brand stuff was I would start changing my URLs every few years. Those kind of became my brands. I was Interaction Artist. I was Hobby Game Dev. I was some other things in the middle, Game Dev Lessons, whatever. And what I realized was when I stuck a brand to it, I could move on from it. I could meet people at GDC next year and they'd be like, oh, you're the Interaction Artist guy. I'm like, oh, no, I'm not doing that anymore. Now I'm doing Hobby Game Dev. And I'd been able to kind of leave behind the assumptions about what that was, what it was for, who it was about, the scale it operated, the pattern it was in, and be like, no, I'm doing this other thing now. And that's part of what Gamkedo's let me do is to, like, right now, there's certainly, and for the foreseeable future, where my heart's at, what I'm doing, what I'm all about, et cetera. If for some reason, and I don't, if I foresaw this happening, I wouldn't still be doing what I'm doing. But if for some reason there came some sort of point where this thing grew in a way that it either did not make sense to carry on in the way that it had, or needed to shapeshift into something else, or needed to be rebranded or whatever, then, I could say, oh, no, Gamkedo was how things were done last year. Now we're doing this other thing. And that's separate from me and who I am. And that's something that you're able to do when you have a brand attached to something in a way you can't without it. And the other part about just like my own personal background stuff is that partly, it allows me to separate out that the club is about certain things, certain approaches, certain, the club is what it is, as opposed to my life and my background and who I am and what I do is more than just that. I'm not someone who like there's the lead singer of the band, such and such, and then like that's all we know the human being about or for. I think it's important to me that I maintain an identity separate from just a function within a business, just a role within a company, just a face behind a brand label. And that's where occasionally I'll have someone who will comment something on the YouTube videos, kind of the opposite of the earlier comment about like, I appreciate these aren't just speed coding videos, who will just be like, when did a coding channel turn into like a talking channel? And I'm just like, I don't care. I'm going to be me. And this channel is me. And if they don't want that, there's infinite other content on the internet they can go find. I don't work for them. I'm not their employee. Done. Conversation ended. And the other part comes from when someone is trying to figure out, okay, they're looking into my club. Occasionally they're like, I haven't heard of this guy. Okay, let's be fair. Most of the time, like, I haven't heard of this guy. So they Google me, and what they find needs to be something more than my picture on that page. And that's why I maintain ChrisDeLeon.com and my Chris DeLeon profile on Twitter and otherwise, where they can also find out, like, what's this person about? What else have they done that's not this thing? Because I used to try to merge them so much that it really distracted from – it was hard to tell the story of Gamkedo without also telling the story of the college clubs I ran before it, without also telling the story of my 20 years of game development experience prior to that, the awards, the other stuff, where, like, in some ways it was maybe trying to help sell or position it. In other ways, it just felt like a distraction from, okay, but what's this current thing? And this allows me to distill them better in a way that I feel like there's still a history of me online, but it's not the same as the history of this organization.
Man, you got me thinking. You got me thinking on that one, because I have been challenged with, especially in making games, having the idea of a studio Twitter and then a personal Twitter and then a Twitter for the games you release. And it gets to be a lot for one person to manage. Not to mention, you feel like you're growing one list, one group of the attention of certain people, and then those people don't know who you are on an individual level and vice versa. So yeah, that is some soul searching I think I'm going to have to do after the podcast. So something I thought would be interesting to talk with you about, and we just have a couple more things, is talking about Patreon. I saw that you've been doing Patreon and you've been doing Patreon successfully, and I've been telling people that Patreon isn't my favorite thing. So I would like to be the devil's advocate on us discussing some of the value from Patreon. So viewing it from the level of a small developer, I feel like the number of people in your audience who actually end up contributing to a Patreon is a percentage of a percent, right? It's a very small percentage.
I think it depends on the kind of business somebody's running and how they position their Patreon.
Okay, so let's look at, so yours is with content marketing. So I feel like it's slightly different from the game development world. But what if I am a game developer, I'm making games, it's going to be a long time till I release it, so I'm going to be setting up a Patreon.
Sure, I agree. That is a terrible reason to run a Patreon, and that is not, I don't think, going to be successful. And for what it's worth, so my Patreon does not have huge number of Patrons, but the earnings from my Patrons combined is substantially higher than people assume from the number of Patrons that I have. But it's partly because, again, I go back to this earlier point of like, I'm not selling $3 apps. I'm not selling $1 apps. In my Patreon case, for $40, I can sponsor a member of the club who couldn't otherwise afford participation in our international practice group. For $75, they're sponsoring 2 members, and those are reduced rates of what otherwise is like $60 per person if someone's paying their own. And that enables people around the world who are from low-income situations, third world countries without the same sort of strength as the U.S. dollar, et cetera, maybe places where just PayPal doesn't even work because of their infrastructure and so on, to take part in our club and benefit from it and like really help change these people's lives. That's a different kind of positioning and selling than trying to sell something that kind of low value, which is also why when Patreon got hit with that recent change where there was this fear of they're going to pass on the fees and a ton of $1 Patreons dropped off from people, I saw my dial didn't move because the problem was some people were going to go from $1 a month to like $1.35 a month. And we're like, whoa, I didn't expect a 35% increase. And like a lot of my Patreons were like, okay, I'm going from a $40 a month to $40.35. I don't care because it was just this blip on the radar. But really what differentiates that kind of difference of doing it isn't just the difference in the price level. It's also the difference of the fact that I built out and proved what I was doing before I built a Patreon around it. it wasn't until I'd been running the club for a year and a half or two, we had released maybe 30 plus games. I've been able to demonstrate. I've been helping a lot of people this way. Like this, we have a system that works. What I need is help feeding more people into it who otherwise couldn't afford it. And I can do so at a discount because we can kind of subsidize it by meeting in the middle. And what this enabled me to do was I was always making exceptions for like somebody want to take part in our club. They were in a low income situation. My mission is to help people anyway. And I kind of like try to work out a deal where like, okay, for this like extremely discounted rate, or in some cases, frankly, for free, someone who otherwise couldn't have participated in the group could, so they could try to derive the benefits of it. And the problem is that didn't scale in a way that I could not proactively go out there and recruit people for. I can't do this. I mean, I tried for many years to mentor people without pay, and in order to make a sustainable business out of it and ensure I'm delivering on value, that's just not how you can structure things. But now that I actually have sponsors, when I have an increase in sponsors, I can actually proactively go out there and kind of pound the pavement and recruit and be like, look, I'm not hitting you up for money. I'm not trying to get you to pay me anything. Someone else will be covering your costs. But if you'll apply to this, you can benefit from it. Everyone in the group will be glad that you're there. It can help improve your portfolio, can help give you team experience, can help give you GitHub, like kind of demonstration stuff for your outside portfolio, help improve your performance in interviews, all these kind of benefits in a way that it's the same way that universities, for all their ups and downs, can recruit people who would be scholarship cases. Because they're not saying come here and, blow your entire family's life savings here. They're saying our institution would be glad to have you come take part in what we're doing. And that's something I'm able to do in part through this because, and it's not just that, it's not just filtering for talent or expertise, whatever, but is that's something that gets opened up in a way that otherwise doesn't. A lot of our sponsored cases are people who are just starting, just beginners. It's not just for super experienced or impressive people or anything like that. But it's something that makes it a different sort of way for me to try to promote the group because I have slots to fill as opposed to some other sort of connection to what's going on there. Now, this is the same sort of thing that I liked about Farsight Studios and how they handled their pinball games, where I'm a huge pinball advocate. I did my research in pinball in grad school, and a lot of what they're about is they're about preservation of pinball culture in a way that these machines are breaking. The repair people are no longer around. The manufacturing companies no longer produce the parts. But there's these classics of early game history that are being lost, and they had already demonstrated by the time they ran a Kickstarter, Patreon, whatever they were doing, they demonstrated that they were successfully releasing titles on PlayStation, on Vita, on GameCube, on whatever platforms were around at the time, where they were faithfully recreating these classic arcade machines with permission and licensing from Bally and Gottlieb and Williams and whoever. But what they had not been able to make a good business case to do, and it's part of why we didn't see more of these kind of games, was to also pay for Patrick Stewart's likeness to make a Star Trek machine, also pay for Arnold Schwarzenegger's license to be able to make a Terminator machine, and all these kind of other like IPs that are specific to the things that aren't just a pinball machine, but a pinball machine plus the movie license. And so what they did was they made a case for like, look, we have a working business model. We've delivered on it consistently. But if the Kickstarter fans out there, or crowdsource, Indiegogo, however they did it, can help us basically cover the cost of the movie license, then we know how to make the rest of the machinery work. And sure enough, that resulted in the Twilight Machine, Terminator game, a ton of these other movie license games being digitally recreated that before that, there kind of wasn't as strong of a business case to be built for as compared to the machines that didn't have some sort of license attached to it. And so to me, that's where the difference comes in, is to, can someone demonstrate first that they have delivered value, they're creating a working product, they have a business that works, and then on top of that, getting people to kind of help fuel some piece of it that couldn't operate otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because I feel like I've seen where it's people want to figure out what they can do to have people pay on a Patreon. And it's like, you know what, I'll put out content or I'll give these people scripts early for the videos I'm putting out. And they just are sort of coming up with these things on the fly as opposed to having the product or service first and then using this to sort of fund that.
Yeah, and I talked about this on some other interview recently, but a lot of it also has to do with that traditionally funding sources aren't just funding. There's this old advice from Silicon Valley that if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. Because as soon as someone who has a money source puts money in your business, part of why that now that their growth of investment relies upon you knowing what the heck you're doing and not screwing it up, they take an interest in trying to make sure you're getting the right connections. You're not going down the rabbit trail. You're not wasting time. You're using your energy efficiently. And that's something that's completely lost in a crowdfunding scenario as to if it's raising money off consumers on the one hand, it's great to not have those strings pulled from the outside. On the other hand, it is the opposite of getting experienced perspective and valuable industry connections because it's literally like they're not used to seeing things from that production side. And instead are going to come at it from an area of severe misunderstanding about how long things take, the difficulties and challenges involved, the practicalities of running a studio, legal overhead, et cetera, all is just going to get lost on them because it's not their domain. It's not their job to know. And that's one of the downsides of these sort of funding venues. And again, too, this is all coming from a world where nothing I've even talked about or have done myself connects to certainly a lot of other Patreon stories of people who they're webcomic artists, they're doing other kind of things. That whole realm is sort of just not a part of what I connect to or understand from that sphere. Some people seem to be doing it, some people not nearly successfully. And that's also where I think it's a useful reminder that for any of these platforms, whether it's a crowdfunding one, whether it is Steam, App Store, Itch, GOG, whatever, in this very bizarre way, we have this natural kind of sense, and it's a very broken one, of our inability to estimate, okay, well, these games are doing really well, or these courses are doing really well on Udemy or whatever. And we have this absolute necessary selective blind spot for all the ones that are basically pretty similar, but nowhere near that level of financial success. And there's this unfortunate kind of reality that it actually really works in a platform's best interest to have success stories. That if and this is there's other reasons why this happens, but like emergently, lots of people playing Angry Birds can discuss Angry Birds, get to know Angry Birds, recognize Angry Birds brand, etc. But really, for a company like Apple, they know it's going to lure a lot more people to a platform knowing some success stories of multimillionaires, billionaires, et cetera, whatever, because those are going to lure people to the pile like a huge lottery winning, more so than if a whole bunch of people like kind of squeaked by. And so it is kind of often in the interest of a platform to really spotlight, highlight, feature certain people to kind of boost and exaggerate those stories, because that helps lead press back to their platform. And I think some people maybe overlook that that's part of the dynamic that's sometimes at play.
Right, and it's one of those chicken and the egg things, I think. Like to get coverage, you have to have coverage first.
Yep.
So kind of tough.
Yeah.
But all right, well, one last question I wanted to leave us on is where are we going to see Chris DeLeon 5 years from now?
Interesting. Yeah, so certainly I hope still with doing Gamkedo stuff. I've got various sort of things I'm trying to do to help. A lot of the questions I'm tackling now is what do I need to change about the club so it works with maybe 5 times as many members as we have now? And so there's things that have to do with possibly people. We have some really established and skilled members in other time zones. I'm trying to work out the logistics of how or when it would make sense for them to run a separate meeting for people who are live Sunday, kind of about noon time meeting doesn't work. But a lot of it really should just coming down to finding better ways to help grow the Gamkedo stuff in a way that works for more people, in a way that more people kind of understand and recognize the value of. Increasingly, I've tried to make my story and my path less about, and this is, I say increasingly, like starting from 2004, less about my projects, less about me, less about my games, and much more about where have the people I've worked with gone on to. And so that's where already, and in a way I can't really take credit for their success, but my clubs helped them as early stepping stones. People who went on to work on that game company on Journey, people who went on to work on God of War franchise, people who went on to work on Destiny 2, et cetera, are people who came from my college organizations. And so I'm trying to help build some of those same kind of stories for people who are coming through Gamkedo Club, who in many cases have gotten maybe their first contract gigs, their first paying work, their first in some cases we have people who weren't software engineers yet. They were in like human management side, went over to software engineering through their game experience. And, part of the reason for the differences of story is that first club started 13, 14 years ago. The second club started 7 or 8 years ago. This current one's been around for 3. And so we haven't had quite as long of an arc. But part of doing the long game with integrity in terms of like delivering value, really making a difference to people, not just selling them something and not caring if they don't finish the course, not just caring if they just kind of hang out and spend money and don't do anything, is being able to demonstrate and speak to those kind of results. So hopefully in 5 years, people won't be thinking about me. They'll be thinking about people that I've been able to help kind of build a stepping stone for out of the work that I'm doing.
Oh, that's awesome. And I love the idea of playing the long game, So where can people find you online?
Sure. Gamkedo, that's Gamkedo. There's no E in the middle. A lot of people misspell it Gamkedo. I do actually own the domains and email addresses, so it'll redirect people, but that's the Twitter handle. That'll help them find the podcast. That'll help them find the website. Or Chris DeLeon, just ChrisDeleon is the Twitter handle as well as the website for my personal stuff.
All right, Chris, thanks so much for talking with us today. And all the links he mentioned you can find in the show notes at GameDevDeconstructed.com. Thanks for talking to me over Skype today, and we're hoping you much success.
Sweet. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for interviewing today.
All right, thank you. For show notes and links mentioned in the podcast, visit GameDevDeconstructed.com. Support the podcast by following us on Facebook and Twitter, and by rating and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you stream the show. That's all for this episode, and I hope to see you all next time.